Thank you, Emily, very much. And I'm so happy to be here. It took about a bunch of time to travel here, travel delays, plane delays, stuff like that, but I'm here. So I'm sorry I missed most of you throughout the day, but I'm sure I will learn from Emily all the wonderful stuff that you discussed. But my job right now is to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Sarah Bronin, who is a Mexican American architect and attorney whose interdisciplinary research in the areas of poverty, land use, historic preservation, and energy focuses on how law and policy can foster more equitable, sustainable, well-designed, connected places. As a leading voice on historic preservation law and related land use practices, Ronan was recently nominated by the Biden administration to chair the U.S. Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The Council advises the President and Congress on decisions and policies to promote the preservation and enhancement of historic resources. In addition to her books and treatises on land use and historic preservation, Bronin has written over 24 articles on renewable energy, climate change, housing, urban planning, transportation, real estate development, and federalism. And the intersectionality of those things are something I'm anxious to learn more about, and hopefully Sarah can enlighten us. In her forthcoming book, Key to the City, will explore how zoning rules changes our lives, or rules our lives. She advised the National Trust of Historic Preservation and Sustainable Development Code, has served on the board of Latinos and Heritage Conservation, and founded Desegregate Connecticut. And as a member of the Congress of New Urbanism and a devotee of Richard Driehaus, she also received the Richard Driehaus Form-Based Code Award for the Hartford Housing Code, Form-Based Codes Institute, and Smart Growth America. And one of the things that I'm also interested in learning more about is Desegregate Connecticut, where she was the founder and lead organizer. And their focus was to lead a housing justice reform movement to reform land use laws. And as such, she oversaw volunteers and staff and created a coalition of over 80 nonprofit organizations and raised the money for public education and advocacy. So Sarah is a talented person with many attributes I think that we all can learn from, and I'm anxious to do so. So Sarah, it's all yours.
Okay, I think I need the clicker, if you have one. Jackie, thank you so much for that overly kind introduction. It's an honor to finally meet you, and given all of your great work, I'm sure we could learn far more from you than you will from me. So my topic today is not historic preservation, although I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Thank you. But it is about zoning data. And come to find out when I woke up this morning that President Biden had announced the biggest plan so far in his administration to help to alleviate housing costs and address the nation's housing shortage. So for anybody who's been on Twitter today, who's been chatting at your lunch tables about this has been pretty big news in the housing and zoning community. So I'm actually going to use it as a jumping off point to justify what I was already going to talk about today. One of the big aspects of that plan, in fact, the very first element, is that the White House plans to tie federal funding to zoning reforms. In other words, to encourage and incentivize local jurisdictions to do all the things that we've been talking about today, to change their zoning reforms. But the bullet point that you have there on your screen is pretty vague. It's pretty broad. Maybe I shouldn't say vague, I should say broad. We don't know what the particulars will entail, but in this case, the devil is in the details, and I really am excited to learn more. My biggest response to the plan today is that to measure change, to measure whether communities have reformed, you need a baseline. And if you're doing this on a national scale, you need actually a national baseline, an understanding of how zoning codes are across the country. There are probably 30,000 local jurisdictions, and we need a way to compare those across jurisdictions, across state lines and regional lines. we really don't know the answer to this question. You guys know in Chicago, but I've heard lots of really interesting research that's been done today, but we don't really know that across the country. So I'm going to just tease the idea now, and I'll come back to this at the end, for a national zoning atlas. So my lab at Cornell, the Legal Constructs Lab, that's the name we gave it, has decided, perhaps foolishly, to announce that we're launching a national zoning atlas and to try to get as many collaborators as we can to try to have state-specific projects and region-wide projects that will actually enable us to understand on a national scale how local governments zone. And we feel that the best way to do that is to collect information at scale in a standardized way. So the concept behind that, again, I'm just teasing it now, is to translate and standardize zoning information into a unified public interface. And the reason I framed the conversation with this, the President Biden's call from the White House, and then our pitch for many people, many hands making light work across the country to make a national zoning atlas, is really rooted in a motivation to understand lots of different issues. So a zoning atlas could tell us about fair housing. It can tell us about transportation, tying decisions like the transit-oriented development that you heard about earlier today, and making investments where we have or will have more dense housing. It can tell us about, it can influence food supply. It can tell us about economic opportunity. It can tell us where people best have access to nature. And one not on this list, but it can tell us the links between zoning and access to education. I'm working on research right now on that. This was all motivated, or the idea for this was all motivated by the effort that Jackie mentioned in her introduction, which is an effort called Desegregate Connecticut, which emerged in June 2020 in Connecticut after many in the state realized how zoning in Connecticut has led to disparate outcomes and has led to some of the worst racial and economic segregation in the country. This is a page on our website that talks about the justifications for zoning reform. There's an environmental justification, an economic justification, and of course the equity justification that motivated many of us to join the movement. But one of the things that we got asked when we first formed in June 2020 was, how does Connecticut zone now? You're making all of these wild allegations about what zoning is and does. And we realized we really couldn't answer that question. So before we get to how we answered that question, I wanted to introduce you to our team. I loved hearing today about the Minneapolis More Neighbors project. I thought that was incredible. And it kind of reinforces what we, or echoes what happened in Connecticut with Desegregate Connecticut, which is essentially, we just sort of looked around and tried a bunch of different things and started to just gain more support. And this was our team. And you can see just by glancing that I'm the oldest person on this image by far. And the team was really attracted young people, undergrads, grad students, law students, community residents, high schoolers, and others. But again, young professionals, but again, a broad swath of young people from different economic circumstances who came together and said, well, we have social media skills. Well, we have graphic skills. Well, we have public speaking skills. We have mapping skills, and all came together and really just started meeting on a weekly basis, and then became the core team for what became and now still is Desegregate Connecticut. As Jackie mentioned, we have 80 over the course of a year or so. We got the bulk of our supporters through these nonprofit organizations that you see here. Everyone from affordable housing groups to environmental groups, as well as the Regional Plan Association, which became our fiscal sponsor and now houses the program now that we've raised some money for it. But the National Association of Home Builders. So for home builders and environmentalists to be part of one organization, it's pretty rare, at least from my experience, but we were really glad to have that happen. The APA, the American Planning Association, and the AIA were also leading members, as well as a historic preservation community. So all three statewide preservation nonprofits were part of the Desegregate Connecticut Coalition from the beginning. And I can talk about that if folks are interested. So with that in mind, we built this Connecticut Zoning Atlas. We let me go back actually. With that team in mind and those nonprofits in mind, we kept getting asked the question, well, how does Connecticut zone? How do you know we need reform? And this is an image of the Connecticut Zoning Atlas itself. It's online at zoningatlas.org/Connecticut. And what it does is it documents, in part with some of the team members that you saw, but actually with about 30 people outside of that team who helped to document all 180 zoning jurisdictions in Connecticut, 2,600 zoning districts, and we looked at 32,000 pages of zoning text. And what we did was we tied information about zoning to geospatial layers of each individual district. Now, for some, that might seem obvious, like, of course you would need to do that. But much of the recent zoning research, actually going back decades, has not relied on this method of actually understanding what zoning codes say. Instead, it has relied on survey-based methods, asking planners what they think their zoning code says, a method that has been prone to error because, of course, we all make mistakes. So this is looking at the actual zoning code and showing district by district how much land has these characteristics that we include. So just to give you a quick run through, since my talk is about data, of what this shows. When you go to the atlas, you select options on the left. So here we've selected single family housing. This shows where land meeting the criteria shows up. So this is prefacing one of my next slides. Purple is a hit. So this shows you how much of Connecticut is purple, how much of Connecticut allows for single family housing. That's actually 91% of the state. The atlas can then show if a town or if a town's certain neighborhoods in town zone primarily single family housing, allow accessory apartments, zones for multifamily housing, including around our Connecticut fast track and train stations. We have little radii around those. And also it has toggles for different minimum lot sizes. So some very small number of jurisdictions have no minimum lot sizes, but many have actually 81% of residential land, we found out, has 1 acre minimum lot sizes. That's crazy. Everybody should be gasping. 1 acre minimum lot sizes. That's like enormous. Okay. All right. So basic findings of the atlas, which could only really be found through this very tedious manual method of tracking this zoning data, is that 91% of land, and this is the map you already saw, allows for single family housing as of right. And this is the amount of land that allows for 4 or more family housing as of right. It's 2% of land in the state. That's a big difference. And again, only made possible, this finding, by this method of collecting information. So this was the very first piece of information that we released in answer to that question, how do you know we have a problem? Well, I think this pretty much tells us that we do. Zooming into a particular area, the atlas shows 1, 2, 3, and 4 family housing. So here's New Haven, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a kangaroo in the middle. This shows 2 family housing. The first image was single family housing. So this is single family. This is 2 family housing, 3 family, and 4 family housing as of right. So again, you can really see the kangaroo because that's where all the purple is. New Haven, which is a central city, very demographically diverse and a poorer city in comparison to its suburban counterparts, has all of the multifamily housing. We will be doing secondary research on the impacts, where the multifamily zoning is, and what the demographic characteristics of areas with multifamily housing are. But I think we already can write the papers without even doing the analysis, honestly. We're doing it, though. In addition to just that basic number of unit measure, so lots of people, and we've talked a little about this today, advocates have made the call that we should eliminate single-family housing. I'm just going to put this on the floor, or it will fall. But that's not actually enough to do, and you've heard that again also today, to try to illustrate what I've called the 1,000 cuts of zoning. We're looking at we gathered information about all of these other specific characteristics, actually 90 of them. So this is just kind of a teaser, but minimum lot sizes, minimum unit sizes, maximum density in units per acre, minimum parking requirements, and actually breaking that down into studio and 1 bedroom and 2 or more family, 2 or more bedroom apartments. We found jurisdictions in Connecticut that had 3 units of parking required for studio apartments. That's Darien, Connecticut, Lebanon, a couple others. You really have to work really hard to think of creative things like that will definitely thwart housing, but they have risen to that challenge. We've tracked affordable housing code definitions and maximum number of bedrooms. So there are zoning codes that say, well, there's a maximum number of bedrooms that you can have. Usually it's 1, sometimes it's 2, and so on. So we also tracked a lot of information about accessory units. So if you just looked at whether a town allows accessory dwelling units, this is what the map looks like. So this is the selection of where accessory dwelling units are allowed anywhere. But this is where you get back down to those 1,000 cuts. So this is where accessory dwelling units are allowed without occupancy restrictions, without constraints on whether they have to be owner occupied, or whether there is a ban on renters, or whether it has to be an employee. And some zoning codes use the word servant or a family member, whether it can be non-elderly. So this shows you, wow, you went from 94% of jurisdictions that have some accessory housing to, with these occupancy requirements, just a handful. And then we looked at 2 physical requirements, whether you can have an ADU in a garage, like you can have here in Chicago, it sounds like, or whether you can have an ADU that doesn't have a maximum size. So lots of jurisdictions will cap ADUs and say it has to be a maximum of 1,000 square feet, and you get no purple at all. Actually, there's purple in Hartford, but you can't see it because of all of the different zoning jurisdictions. We rezoned in Hartford pretty aggressively for housing. Zoning by 1,000 cuts is what I call it. There's a paper on SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, that goes through all of this Connecticut findings. I want to talk about a couple more things. So using that data, we have been able to model in 3D some of the house. We picked actually 15 jurisdictions with high walk scores, and we found, so you can take any one of these characteristics and take it away and see what happens. So in these images, you see places where more housing would result if all you did was eliminate minimum parking requirements. So these are all places: Bridgeport, Norwalk, and Waterbury, mid to large cities for Connecticut. Our biggest city is Bridgeport, which is about 130,000 people, nothing like Chicago. But if you just took away minimum parking requirements, Bridgeport could have, with doing nothing else in zoning, about 100,000 new units of housing. Incidentally, just a couple months ago, Bridgeport did eliminate minimum parking requirements. And so joining Hartford in completely eliminating them. You don't need them in Chicago. You should just get rid of them. You can see that areas where minimum parking requirements most constrain housing are on main streets and commercial corridors. The darkest dots here show where the most housing could be built if not for minimum parking requirements. So this kind of illustrates one of the many reasons why the historic preservation community has gotten on board for zoning reform, because it actually deters reinvestment in historic places. If you're really interested in how we use the Atlas for advocacy, Desegregate Connecticut has put out a series of brochures or reports, issue briefs, one on lot sizes, one on transit-oriented development, equitable transit-oriented development. I was really glad to see that phrase used here today. The economic and the environmental case for zoning reform. All of these used data that was gleaned from the Zoning Atlas to explain to the public in hopefully words that lots of different people could understand, the reasons that we needed to do better on zoning. So that brings us around to the National Atlas. So you can see that in Connecticut, our Connecticut Zoning Atlas not only gave us more information that people can use within their own community about how their community zones, but it allows us to compare jurisdictions to each other. It also allowed us to make a case for statewide zoning reform, which we did in fact achieve a year and a day after Desegregate Connecticut first met. So in June 2021, the legislature passed a suite of zoning reforms that legalized accessory dwellings, capped parking requirements, instituted an affirmatively furthering fair housing provision for zoning changes and zoning codes themselves, and did a whole bunch of other things, required training for commissioners that we hope will lead to more equitable zoning in the state. In taking all of those lessons and how we collected the data, which was a fairly haphazard process because we didn't even know what we were making when we started collecting information about zoning codes. But we finally figured out what we were doing, and we thought other people might want to know how we did that. So also up on SSRN is a how to make a zoning atlas guide, which goes through not only the way that we coded each individual item in our zoning code atlas, but also now features, as of a couple weeks ago, the code information about links to the actual code, computer code that was used to create the maps themselves. Although we are hoping to receive copious funding to build the National Atlas in the meantime, for those places that don't want to replicate what we did from scratch, those places, other states can actually produce their own atlases as we gear up for the national project and the framework that will hopefully reduce that need for other places to actually do that. Right now, my students are working on a New York zoning atlas. There's my project manager, a graduating MRP student, Adam Bailey, who has helped to manage the New York atlas. So that project is underway. We have broken New York up into regions. The New York City region is being done by Fordham Law School. Buffalo, Erie County is being done by University of Buffalo. Niagara County is being done by a local planner there. Long Island is being done by the Regional Plan Association. And in addition to that, we have support from the New York Department of Homes and Community Renewal, which has given us zoning information for a slew of other towns across the state. But we need a lot more to go when it comes to the small towns across the state in order for us to actually fill out each and every part of the atlas. But I think we'll have a pretty good start in the next 3 to 6 months to post. We also have projects in 4 other states and several more to come online. But one of my favorite projects is the Montana Zoning Atlas, which is being done by a right-leaning libertarian institute called the Frontier Institute. And it's being funded by the right-leaning Mercatus Center at George Mason University. They've actually started using our methodology for 6 cities, and now they just got funding to expand that to the rest of the state and to expand what they've done in the 6 cities too. So there's other New Hampshire, Ohio, Hawaii, and one other state that I can't remember is also working on these projects. Okay. Last couple of things I wanted to mention about how we are using this data and collecting this data. So those of you who heard about Urban Institute knows it's a premier think tank on a variety of urban issues, and it has a couple of researchers there who really focused on zoning. And I'm working with them to take the answers that we've received in the Connecticut Zoning Atlas through our manual coding to try to develop machine learning processes that will enable us to collect the data faster in other jurisdictions. In other words, we're trying to train a computer program to read a zoning code like a human would, to be able to find the right words, the right phrases, in order to save this painstakingly tedious manual labor that results from reading 32,000 pages of zoning codes. If a machine can spit out the names of the districts and give us some basic information about them, that might save us a lot of time and will help speed the process in the future. We're also working on a project that is going to help us weigh the different aspects of these findings and try to understand how the way that a town zones can impact demographic characteristics as well as housing prices. So again, we have all of that information now because we know what percentage of each town is subject to all of the kinds of restraints. So what percentage of towns are subject to parking, FAR requirements, height caps, and so on. We know that, and so we're going to be able to figure out, hopefully, a more updated zoning restrictiveness index than the one that many scholars have relied on, which in turn relies on survey data. So my last question for you all in this room, since so many of you are Illinois focused, is will Illinois join Connecticut, Hawaii, Montana, New Hampshire, New York, and Ohio? No, I did get them all right, in creating its own zoning atlas. And so rumor has it that CMAP, the University of Chicago, and UIC will be collaborating on an Illinois zoning atlas, funding permitting. And so hopefully we will see that more publicly announced and officially announced, as opposed to my rumor has it type announcement today. But if you think about all of the conversations that we've had here today that are rooted in Chicago, this region, and the state, much of the picture would become a lot more clearer if you had the ability, as both policymakers and researchers, but also advocates, to have the ability to compare very easily in a couple of clicks the way that each jurisdiction zones, and to calculate on the map itself, as we have in Connecticut, the percentage of each jurisdiction that actually allows for certain zoning. So I'm hopeful that that will happen, and hopefully that will happen very soon. So I'll answer my own question to just say, can data about zoning improve zoning? Yes, it can. I think we've shown that in Connecticut. And I'll just say thank you, because I hope there will be some questions that will be more interesting than me talking on at the end of the day. And this is my Twitter handle. I'm happy to engage there. Thanks. Anybody is fine. I'm here all
Hi,
night.
thank you. I believe I actually read a New York Times article about the desegregation project in Connecticut, and it was very interesting to see that you're speaking now. I'm curious, what kind of additional programs and procedures might have been put in place in addition to some of the zoning laws, like as part of that kind of desegregation plan? I'm assuming, zoning is a piece of that, but likely there was additional steps. Chicago has obviously a very segregated city, and zoning in itself is likely not to be enough. So I'm just curious, kind
For
of what other
sure,
steps.
for sure, I agree that zoning is not enough. But in my just experience, zoning is the key barrier. So none of these other financing programs or incentive programs, even maybe, we've seen incentive programs in Connecticut. They don't have any impact if you don't also tackle zoning. That said, the name of our organization is overly ambitious, I would say. It was kind of picked in the heat of the summer of 2020, and I mean, it does suggest a call to action, and really the reason that many of us were motivated to get together, and the reason that these nonprofit organizations and the coalition and young people continue to, support the project, and people all over the state and their communities have started having serious conversations about zoning. So in that sense, the name was positive because it really helped to catalyze and to sharpen why we cared. But on the other hand, I think, of course, our 2-year-old effort is not going to have resulted in desegregation of the state, and certainly zoning is not the only thing that needs to be done. But I will stick with my first comment, which is zoning is essential. It is the building block or the biggest barrier, and no financing in the world can allow for more family housing to be put in a single family zone if the zoning doesn't allow it.
It was just like a chill went up and down my back as you started to talk about this. What in the world clicked 2 years ago that you said desegregate Connecticut and we're going to look at zoning? Right now, it's kind of like, well, that's obvious. But if it's obvious, then we would have done that 20 years ago. So something changed. And I'm asking this because for Illinois and other states to pick up on this, we need to get some of the juice from what it was that got you folks going.
So Connecticut is called the land of steady habits. That is its state. In Connecticut, everybody embraces this slogan. So I think it was very surprising how quickly people moved towards this effort and embraced the idea. that zoning had something to do with the problems that we all see very clearly, even if you move from New Haven to the surrounding suburb. Hartford, where I live, is 85% Black and Latino. The suburbs around are 95% white. So it's so stark, it's visible to the naked eye, and it's something that Connecticut has been living with for a really long time. And the catalyst, for sure, was George Floyd's murder. So shortly after that, of course, all of the other issues, the immediate issues that led to his death were not related to zoning, obviously. But I don't know anything personally about all of the other issues, policing and accountability. But I know about zoning, and so one of the things that that led to our first meeting, which was it had 230 people on a Zoom call, because of course that was post pandemic shutdowns. Was I had emailed the planners listserv, the lawyers listserv, the architects listserv, and my own Twitter accounts, and just send out the Zoom link to anybody who was willing to show up to this meeting. And I explained what the link was between that incident and this embedded racism that has been, that Michael so eloquently spoke about at lunch. And for whatever reason, people were receptive to that message at that time. And that's where the initial ball got rolling. And I'm not saying I did it. I'm saying that people were reflecting back on something they wanted to get involved with. And by starting with the professionals in the state and saying, look, we're all complicit. I had chaired the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years. We actually totally rezoned the city. There is not a single housing unit in the City of Hartford that requires a public hearing. It's all as of right. It's like a housing free-for-all in a way. So we really, and we did that with unanimous support and tons of community involvement in the drafting process, but that's another conversation. But so I'd done, I had lots of ties with local planners, but getting the professionals involved and saying, look, we're all complicit in this if we don't do more, that really, I think, started that. So you could use that kind of guilt trip in a way, or you could just say, look at where we are now. And there's so many different efforts in Chicago that it seems really hard to unify those behind a common banner. And you saw that today with everybody having their own, this is my interest area, this is my interest area, this is my interest area. But there must be somebody out there who can cut through all of that and say, okay, let's just unify around whatever principles we think that the region can handle and move forward. I don't know. And there's no secret behind it. I mean, it just sort of happened the way it happened. But I think people were receptive and wanted to do something. So it was really that team movement forward that caused the things to change.
Sarah, you must know something about the effort to do form-based coding as opposed to just having zoning based on land use. What would you say to form-based coding efforts that are very much focused on the design of place, and so it's really not a housing free-for-all kind of situation? So do you feel that there's some tension there between those efforts?
No, so Hartford's code is a form-based code. It's entirely a form-based code. And I actually think that when you give everybody, the neighborhood, the community groups, the local politicians, the developers, kind of the framework for what options you want to see in a particular community, then they'll build to those options. I mean, they really have the form-based code is out there, they have to do it. It's clear, it's in the code. I had a lawyer tell me, and I wrote an op-ed about this using him, not naming him, but he said I basically ruined his college fund for his kids because the old code was so complicated. The new code was so clear that somebody could just go to that section of the code. They could look and see pictures of similar projects in Hartford that had already been built. So we put photos in the zoning code and said, this is what a downtown building type is like. This is what a house type B is, the most common type of building in Hartford, and said, look, this is what you want. In a house type B, you got a pitched roof, it's 2.5 stories, don't care what the color is, don't care about anything else, but here are like the basic parameters in terms of scale. It has to be built up to the street. I mean, new urbanism type stuff, pretty standard. But we did it citywide, and we use that to help convince, everybody when we rezoned in 2016, that this would smooth processes and would give everybody what they wanted, and it would encourage the kind of sensible and equitable development in a city, an extremely poor city, and where, we had, much like Chicago, actually Hartford was the richest city in the world in the turn of the 20th century, so the early 1900s, and the population was not quite double, but it was much, much higher, and it was a totally different place, and we actually need new people, and we want new people, and we want new families, and we want to build the kind of housing that lots of different kinds of people want. So the form-based code enables us to do that, but to moderate the scale of neighborhood change, to focus on infill for the most part. So yeah, I think it's worked really well in Hartford. We haven't gotten any requests to rezone, no protests on approved housing projects. I'm not saying it's everything is perfect, but it's been pretty successful for our city.
I think we can take one more question. Do you have a preference?
Yeah, sure. You're right there. Or Jackie.
Sure. So, my interest is in the advocacy part of desegregate Connecticut, and the public law that passed. Did that pass as a result of desegregate Connecticut, or was there effort already underway with advocates of saying that we should have this reform in terms of a state law? I know here getting our diverse state to agree on anything is difficult. So I'm just kind of curious about how you were able to do that, or how Connecticut was able to pass such a law.
Yeah, so we wrote that bill word for word, and hoped that some legislators who were friendly would start going through the system. It got changed at the end a little bit, and our transit-oriented provision was hacked off, unfortunately, but it'll come back around. They were not really. So the affordable housing community had been working to do different aspects of zoning reform for a while, but they had been primarily focused on other things, funding and other things. So while they wanted zoning reform, it had not crystallized outside of the housing community that this was a need that everybody needed to be a part of. And as you may go back to the slide, you can see we had major affordable housing advocates, including the Homelessness Coalition, the Partnership for Strong Communities, and lots of others who have been at the legislature for years, trying to advocate for bits and pieces. But what I like to think is that this coalition helped to bring more of a diverse sort of voice to that, and also kind of give them a little wind in their sails to get it over the finish line finally. And some of the things we were advocating for had not come before the legislature, even in concept at all, from that community, like caps on parking mandates. So the bill that was passed caps minimum parking mandates at 1 per studio and 1 bedroom and 2 per 2 bedroom. I tried to convince them to completely eliminate parking mandates like we had in Hartford, and now Bridgeport is done, but they didn't buy that, so we went with the second best option. But I do like to think that we helped to get that over the finish line. We did try to package it as a full suite of reforms. And the testimony for that, so that we went through the Planning and Development Committee, which is where that those kinds of bills go through. And the hearing for that was 24 hours straight. And that's how the Connecticut legislature does it. They don't reconvene. So we knew that. And we knew it would go for 24 hours because we had hundreds of people sign up to actually testify, which was a lot easier to do because it was on Zoom. And so we had pastors and economists. We had experts from out of state. We had young people, high schoolers. We had like anybody who wanted to testify. And it just, the luck of the draw was whoever got up and testified, every single one had a story that resonated with lawmakers enough to get it passed out of the committee when they reconvened to vote. But in terms of how we did that, we had a system of everybody who was signed up gave us their phone number. We texted them at 2 a.m. We called them and said, "You're up next. Wake up, get up, sign into Zoom, and have some good lighting." And So we have tips on testifying. We really made that an operation, much like you would a political campaign. And I mean, maybe that's a little. My husband is a mayor in Connecticut, so maybe a little bit of that kind of bled in to our techniques. But we viewed this as a political campaign to support the kinds of substantive research that we all know in this room supports more zoning reform, and try to make it that more of that popular movement. But I love the images that Yana showed this morning, so I'd love to steal some of those. I sent those to our guys. So if you go to the Desegregate website, we have a series of 30-second videos. If you just go to /videos, that help to explain in ordinary terms what zoning is, how it affects people. And we paid money for those videos to be promoted on Facebook and Twitter and other places. And that was helpful in making that sort of connection. In terms of participation on the Atlas itself, so let me just say, this may be a bad strategy, but literally anybody who says, I want to help with Desegregate Connecticut, we found something for them to do. So if somebody emailed and said, I'm an 8th grader okay, well, here's your marching orders, come to our meeting. We made it very, very open. And so I think part of it is an openness to all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds to come in and volunteer. It was kind of hard to do in the era of the pandemic when you couldn't meet people and kind of see, are you going to stick this out? Are you going to finish this project if we give it to you? But actually everybody did. And creating that sense of cross-generational, cross-disciplinary community was really important. The people behind the website and the briefs and the research, were those people that you saw there, but there were lots of other people who did we did phone banking. We did all kinds of sort of political tactics to try to move both last year and this year forward. Again, back to the zoning atlas though, there too, if any planner, we had a bunch of geospatial professional planners who helped us to collect zoning information. We had city and town officials who would, give us I don't think our elected official agrees with you, but here's this information. Basically undergrad or college student can use the methods of the Atlas. That was not a good project for high schoolers necessarily, or people who didn't have some computer proficiency. But we put anybody who volunteered on the Zoning Atlas collection project. So one of the great things about this National Zoning Atlas project is that it is a perfect project for college participation and nonprofit research and sort of others to get involved with, even private groups. In Ohio, the Ohio Atlas is being led by a private firm, ZoneCo. In other states, so you saw the partners in Connecticut, which are the state, a local official, law and planning schools. You see in other states different kinds of coalitions. So for me, it's been great to see the kinds of collaborations that have emerged. So maybe the CMAP, UC, UIC type of arrangement where you have these great institutions in their own right, but then collaborating to kind of pull all of this together, getting interns who might work for a professor, for 1 month, and then Jake for another month. That has really enriched the students' lives who've participated in it, and it just throws the door open to them also going through that work of understanding. You don't see it when you're in the spreadsheet and like going through these 90 characteristics, but then when you saw the Connecticut Zoning Atlas come together, that's when I got a chill. That's when I said, oh man, like this is even worse than we thought. And that experience of contributing, I think all those people who contributed to the Connecticut Atlas, take that and feel like, yeah, I did my part. I did 3 towns. I found I cleaned the zoning layers, the geospatial layers, and so on. And so I think all of that has been part of a really great project to educate people about zoning, and hopefully we can collectively, it's not really my project. I'm sort of a, collector of other people's projects now, but hopefully we can collaboratively raise the alarm about the power of zoning and the imperative to change it. So thank you.